At the dinner, my daughter-in-law shouted, "Ridiculous old woman, you have no place in this family anymore." Everyone laughed. Then the manager came over, handed me the key to the hotel's most expensive suite, and announced loudly, "She owns this place." Before going in, I took one last action. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The chandeliers above cast a golden glow over the elegant dining room, but I felt anything but elegant sitting at the corner of the table. My son David had chosen this upscale restaurant inside the Grand Harbor Hotel for his 35th birthday dinner, and I should have been happy to celebrate with the family. Instead, I found myself relegated to the far end, squeezed between my grandson Tommy and an empty chair that nobody bothered to fill. "Mom, you're being too quiet tonight," David said from across the table. But his attention was already drifting back to his wife Esme, who was regaling everyone with stories about their recent trip to Europe, a trip I hadn't been invited on, despite having raised David as a single mother and never missing a single birthday of his until tonight. Esme held court at the other end of the table, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing dramatically as she described their 5-star accommodations in Paris. Her blonde hair was styled in loose waves that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, and her designer dress sparkled under the restaurant's lighting. At 42, she was still stunning, and she knew it. "The hotel suite overlooked the Eiffel Tower," she was saying, her voice carrying that slight accent she'd adopted after spending 2 weeks abroad. "David surprised me with champagne and roses every single night. Some men just know how to treat a woman properly." The comment stung, though I wasn't sure if it was intended for me or just her usual way of making everything about herself. I took a small sip of water and tried to focus on Tommy, who was telling me about his soccer practice in whispers. "Grandma Mabel, did you play sports when you were little?" he asked, his innocent 7-year-old eyes bright with curiosity. Before I could answer, Esme's voice cut across the table. "Tommy, sit up straight and eat your vegetables, and don't bother your grandmother with silly questions." My chest tightened. I wasn't bothering anyone, and Tommy's questions certainly weren't silly. But I'd learned over the past 3 years since David married Esme that speaking up only made things worse. "Actually, I played tennis in high school," I told Tommy quietly, ignoring Esme's sharp look. "I was pretty good at it, too." "That's cool, Grandma. Maybe you could teach me sometime." "Maybe," I said, though I knew Esme would never allow it. She controlled Tommy's schedule with military precision, filling every moment with activities that didn't include me. The waiter appeared with our entrees, and I found myself staring at the modest chicken dish I'd ordered while everyone else enjoyed lobster and prime rib. Not that I minded the price difference. I'd been careful with money my entire life. But the message was clear. Even at my own son's birthday dinner, I was an afterthought. "This place is incredible," said my daughter-in-law's sister Miranda, who'd flown in from California for the occasion. "The service, the atmosphere, everything. Esme, how did you find this gem?" Esme preened under the attention. "I have connections everywhere. When you travel in certain circles, you learn about the finer things in life. Not everyone appreciates quality, but I refuse to settle for mediocrity." Another subtle dig. I'd worked double shifts at the textile factory for 20 years to put David through college, and every vacation we'd taken had been to modest motels by the lake. Apparently, that qualified as settling for mediocrity in Esme's world. David raised his wine glass. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Having family around makes everything special." "Not everyone," Esme muttered under her breath, but loud enough for half the table to hear. She shot a pointed look in my direction. "Some people just don't understand how to behave in sophisticated settings." My face burned with embarrassment. I'd been nothing but polite all evening, had dressed in my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd worn to church for the past 5 years, and had kept my conversation appropriate and quiet. "Esme," David said weakly, but she was already continuing. "I mean, look around this place. The crystal, the artwork, the caliber of clientele. Some people simply don't belong in establishments like this." Her eyes met mine directly this time. "It's not their fault, really. They just weren't raised with proper appreciation for elegance." The table fell uncomfortably silent. Miranda looked down at her plate. Tommy continued eating, oblivious to the tension. David cleared his throat but said nothing to defend me. I felt something crack inside my chest. After 69 years on this earth, after raising a son who'd become a successful accountant, after working my fingers to the bone to give him every opportunity I'd never had, I was being dismissed as someone who didn't belong. "Grandma, are you okay?" Tommy whispered, noticing that I'd stopped eating. Before I could answer, Esme's voice rose again. "And another thing. Constantly interrupting adult conversations with random chatter about the past. Nobody wants to hear about tennis from 40 years ago or whatever other irrelevant stories some people insist on sharing." That was it. The breaking point. I set down my fork carefully, my hand surprisingly steady despite the fury building in my chest. "You know what, Esme?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly across the table. "You're absolutely right." She blinked, apparently surprised that I'd spoken up. "I don't belong here," I continued, rising slowly from my chair. "This isn't my kind of place at all." I reached into my purse for my wallet, intending to leave money for my meal and walk out with whatever dignity I had left, but before I could pull out my cash, a tall man in an impeccable black suit appeared beside our table. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice respectful and warm. "I'm so sorry to interrupt your family dinner." I looked up at him, confused. He was the hotel manager. I could tell from his bearing and the small gold nameplate that read, "James Sullivan, General Manager." "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," he continued, pulling something from his jacket pocket. "The front desk has been trying to reach you all evening." He held out an elegant silver keycard attached to a black leather keychain. "Your suite has been prepared as requested. The penthouse level. As always." The entire table stared. Esme's mouth fell open slightly. David looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "I believe you'll find everything to your satisfaction," the manager continued smoothly. "The staff has prepared your usual champagne service, and the concierge has those theater tickets you requested for tomorrow evening." My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. After 12 years of maintaining my anonymity, my secret was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. "Thank you, James," I said quietly, accepting the key card with hands that barely trembled. "I trust everything is in order." "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. Will you be dining in your suite tonight, or would you prefer to finish your meal here with your family?" The word family hung in the air like a challenge. I looked around the table at their shocked faces, Esme pale with confusion, David's mouth working silently, Miranda gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were white. "I think," I said carefully, "I'll retire to my suite. It's been a very educational evening." I turned to Tommy, who was looking between me and the manager with wide, curious eyes. "Good night, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." Then I looked directly at Esme, who was still staring at the keycard in my hand as if it might explode. "Thank you for the lesson in elegance," I said softly. It was quite illuminating. And with that, I walked away from the table, leaving behind my modest chicken dinner and a family that had just discovered their biggest mistake. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt eternal. I stood alone in the mirrored chamber, watching my reflection multiply infinitely around me. A 69-year-old woman in a 5-year-old navy dress, holding a keycard that was worth more than most people made in a lifetime. My hands had finally started to shake, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what had just happened. 12 years. 12 years of keeping this secret, of living modestly in my small apartment while owning one of the most prestigious hotel chains on the East Coast. 12 years of watching my son struggle with his mortgage payments while I could have bought his house outright with pocket change. 12 years of enduring Esme's condescension while sitting on a fortune that would have made her designer clothes look like bargain bin purchases. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor. The doors opened to reveal a private hallway with only one door. The entrance to the penthouse suite that most guests paid $15,000 a night to occupy. I'd never actually stayed here before, preferring to keep my visits to the property brief and professional. But tonight felt different. Tonight, everything had changed. I slipped the keycard into the lock and stepped inside. The suite was breathtaking, Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, marble floors covered with Persian rugs that cost more than cars, and furniture that belonged in a museum. James had mentioned champagne service, and sure enough, a bottle of Dom Perignon sat chilling in an ice bucket beside two crystal flutes. I poured myself a glass and walked to the windows, looking down at the city lights below. Somewhere down there, my family was probably still sitting at that table, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. I could imagine the conversation. David demanding explanations he'd never bothered to ask for before. Esme calculating how much money she'd insulted tonight. Miranda probably Googling the hotel's ownership on her phone. The truth was complicated, and it started with Harold. I'd married Harold Whitmore when I was 22, and he was 35, fresh out of college with dreams of becoming a teacher. He was gentle and kind. Nothing like my own father who'd drunk away every paycheck we'd ever had. Harold worked at the elementary school, and I took whatever jobs I could find. Cleaning houses, working retail, anything to make ends meet. When David was born 2 years later, we were struggling but happy. Harold would come home from school and immediately take over with the baby, giving me a chance to rest before my evening shift at the diner. We had plans. Modest ones, but plans nonetheless. A little house with a yard, maybe another child someday. A comfortable retirement. Then Harold got sick. Cancer took him slowly. Over the course of 18 months, I watched the man I loved waste away while medical bills piled up like autumn leaves. The insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Never enough. I sold everything we owned except David's crib and my wedding ring, worked 3 jobs simultaneously, and still fell further behind every month. The night Harold died, I was sitting in a hospital chair that had become my second home, holding his hand and wondering how I was going to raise a 3-year-old son with $16,000 in debt and no prospects beyond minimum wage jobs. That's when Harold's lawyer called. Apparently, my gentle schoolteacher husband had been more than he seemed. His grandfather had been a real estate mogul in the 1920s, and Harold had inherited a trust fund he'd never touched. He'd kept it secret, even from me, because he wanted to live a normal life. He wanted to earn his own way, to know that people loved him for himself rather than his money. The trust was worth $2.3 million. I stared at the paperwork for hours, certain there had been a mistake. Harold had lived on a teacher's salary while sitting on a fortune. He'd watched me work myself to exhaustion while he could have paid off our house with loose change from his inheritance. At first, I was angry. How could he have let me struggle like that? How could he have kept such an enormous secret while I was cleaning other people's toilets to pay for groceries? But then I found his letter. He'd written it 3 days before he died, explaining everything. The money had been a burden to him, he said. He'd watched it corrupt his own father, had seen cousins and siblings turn vicious fighting over portions of the family wealth. He wanted David to grow up knowing the value of work, the satisfaction of earning something yourself. He wanted me to have choices the money could provide, but he trusted me to make wise ones. Use it to build something good, he'd written in his careful teacher's handwriting. But don't let it change who you are. Don't let it change how David sees the world. Money should be a tool, not a master. So I'd used it carefully. I invested in real estate, starting small with apartment buildings in decent neighborhoods. I learned everything I could about property management, about renovation and development. I reinvested every penny of profit, growing the portfolio slowly and steadily. When David was 12, I bought my first hotel, a struggling property downtown that I renovated and turned profitable. By the time he graduated high school, I owned 4 hotels and 24 rental properties. When he went to college, I could have paid his tuition outright, but I gave him loans instead, small ones, with generous repayment terms, so he'd value his education. I told him I'd gotten a better job, that I was doing well. Technically, that was true. I just didn't mention that doing well meant I was worth somewhere north of $50 million and owned hotels in 6 states. The Grand Harbor had been my crowning achievement. I'd bought it 5 years ago when it was on the verge of bankruptcy, a beautiful but neglected property with a prime location. The renovation had taken 2 years and cost $8 million, but now it was consistently rated as one of the finest hotels on the eastern seaboard. I'd kept my ownership anonymous through a complex web of LLCs and management companies. Even James, the general manager, only knew me as Mrs. Whitmore, the owner's representative. He'd been instructed to provide me with complete discretion and privacy during my visits. Tonight was the first time I'd ever allowed my real identity to be revealed in front of my family. I took another sip of champagne and pulled out my phone. 17 missed calls from David, 12 from Esme, and even 3 from Miranda. I scrolled through the text messages. David. Mom, what the hell is going on? Call me back right now. David. Are you actually the owner of this hotel? I don't understand. David. Mom, please just call me. Esme is freaking out and I need to know what's happening. Esme. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is ridiculous. Esme. David says you really own this place. That's impossible. Call me. Esme. We need to talk. This changes everything. I almost laughed at that last one. This changes everything. Yes, I supposed it did, but not in the way Esme probably thought. I'd spent 12 years watching my son marry a woman who treated me like a burden. I'd sat through countless dinners where she made snide comments about my clothes, my apartment, my modest lifestyle. I'd bitten my tongue when she forgot to invite me to family gatherings, when she scheduled Tommy's activities during my usual visit times, when she rolled her eyes every time I tried to contribute to conversations. I'd told myself I was protecting David's happiness, that if Esme knew about the money, it would change their relationship in ways that might hurt my son. I'd convinced myself that my grandson was better off learning values instead of expecting handouts. But tonight, sitting in a $15,000 a night suite while my daughter-in-law's words echoed in my memory, I realized something important. I hadn't been protecting anyone. I'd been enabling them. By hiding my success, I'd allowed Esme to believe she was superior to me. I'd let her treat me poorly because she thought I was dependent on their charity, someone to be tolerated rather than respected. I'd watched my own son fail to defend me because he'd bought into the same narrative, that his mother was just a struggling widow who needed their patience and kindness. The truth was, I didn't need anything from any of them. I had resources they couldn't imagine, connections they'd never access, and options they'd never even considered. The question now was what I was going to do about it. My phone rang again. David, for the 18th time. This time I answered. Mom? His voice was strained, desperate. Where are you? We need to talk. I'm exactly where I belong, I said calmly, looking out at the harbor view that I owned. In my hotel, in my suite. I don't understand any of this. How long has this been? A long time, David. Longer than you've been married. Silence on the other end. Then quietly, why didn't you tell me? I closed my eyes, thinking of Harold's letter, of all the careful choices I'd made to protect my son from the complications wealth could bring. Because I wanted you to become the man you are based on your own merit, I said. And you did. You're successful, hardworking, honest. You built a good life for yourself. But Mom, if you had this kind of money, why did you let me struggle with the mortgage? Why didn't you help when Tommy needed those medical tests last year? Why did you live in that tiny apartment when you could afford? Because handouts don't build character, I said, repeating the wisdom Harold had tried to teach me. You're proud of what you've accomplished because you earned it. Would you really want to take that away from yourself? Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger somehow. She's been awful to you, hasn't she? All this time she thought you were poor, I finished for him. Yes, and that told me everything I needed to know about her character. I could hear voices in the background. Esme demanding to know what I was saying, insisting that David put the call on speaker. Mom, David said urgently, don't make any hasty decisions. We can work this out. Esme's just shocked. We all are. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Oh, I'm not making any hasty decisions, sweetheart. I've had 12 years to think about this, and tonight, I finally got the clarity I needed. What does that mean? It means your wife was right about one thing, I said, finishing the last of my champagne. I really don't belong at that table. The truth was, I belonged somewhere much better. I woke up in the penthouse suite to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the distant sound of seagulls over the harbor. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The Egyptian cotton sheets were softer than anything I'd ever slept on, and the mattress had cradled my 69-year-old bones like a cloud. Then, reality came flooding back. The dinner, Esme's cruelty, the revelation that had shattered 12 years of careful secrecy. My phone showed 43 missed calls and countless text messages. I scrolled through them while sipping coffee from a delicate china cup that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. David had called 16 times between midnight and 6 in the morning. His messages grew increasingly frantic as the hours passed. "Mom, please pick up. We need to talk about this. I can't sleep. Esme's been pacing all night. Just tell me what you want from us. I keep thinking about all the times you said you couldn't afford things, all the times I worried about your retirement. Were you lying to me?" That last message stung because I understood his confusion. From David's perspective, I had been lying. Every time I'd declined an expensive restaurant because it was too much, every time I'd bought generic groceries while he struggled with his own budget, every Christmas when I'd given modest gifts while accepting their pity for my financial limitations, it all looked like deception now. But Esme's messages told a different story. "I know you're angry, but we can work this out. David doesn't understand business like I do. You must need something or you wouldn't have revealed this now. Let's discuss terms. I've been researching hotel ownership. We should meet tomorrow to discuss how this affects the family dynamics." Terms. Family dynamics. Even now, even after learning that I owned the very ground she'd stood on while insulting me, Esme was trying to turn this into a negotiation. She saw dollar signs where she should have seen decades of her own cruelty. I set the phone aside and walked to the windows. The harbor stretched out below me, dotted with sailboats and fishing vessels heading out for the day. Somewhere down there, ordinary people were starting their ordinary days, going to jobs they needed, worrying about bills they couldn't quite cover. I'd been one of them once, and in many ways, I still felt like one of them. That was Harold's gift to me, I realized. He'd given me wealth without letting it change who I was at my core. I'd remained the same woman who'd scrubbed floors and waited tables, who'd known what it felt like to choose between groceries and medicine. The money had been a tool, exactly as he'd intended. But watching Esme's messages pile up, seeing how quickly she'd shifted from contempt to calculation, I understood something else. The money had also been a test, and my family had failed it spectacularly. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find James, the hotel manager, with a breakfast cart and a respectful smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you." I stepped aside to let him wheel in the cart. "James, I need to ask you something. In your professional opinion, how did my family react after I left last night?" He paused in arranging the breakfast service, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Ma'am, I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to." "Please, I value your perspective." He straightened, choosing his words carefully. "The gentleman, your son, seemed genuinely shocked. He kept asking the waitstaff questions about you, about how long you'd owned the property." He appeared, confused, but not unkind. "And my daughter-in-law?" James's expression grew more neutral. "She asked about property values, and whether there were other hotels in the chain. She wanted to know if you had business cards." I almost laughed. Of course she did. "There's something else," James continued hesitantly. "She asked if there were any managerial positions available. She mentioned that she had experience in hospitality." "Esme has never worked in hospitality." "Yes, ma'am." That became apparent when I asked about her background. After James left, I sat alone with my breakfast and the weight of decision. The eggs Benedict was perfect, the orange juice freshly squeezed, the pastries flaky and warm. Everything about this suite, this hotel, this life I'd built in secret, was exactly what Esme had always claimed to value: elegance, sophistication, quality. But she'd never valued the person who'd created it all. I thought about Tommy, My 7-year-old grandson who'd asked me about tennis and called me grandma with genuine affection. He was innocent in all of this, caught between a mother who saw people as assets and a father who'd inherited his own father's gentle nature but lacked the strength to stand up for what was right. David wasn't a bad man. He was weak, perhaps, when it came to his wife, but he'd never been deliberately cruel. He'd simply allowed cruelty to happen around him, which wasn't the same thing but wasn't entirely different either. I pulled out my laptop and opened the secure portal I use to manage my properties. The screen showed a real-time overview of my holdings: 12 hotels, 37 rental properties, and various commercial investments spread across 6 states. The total value fluctuated daily, but it was currently sitting at just over $68 million. More money than my family could spend in several lifetimes, but they'd never see a penny of it. Not anymore. I opened a new document and began typing. Not a will. I'd update that later through proper legal channels, but a list. A comprehensive inventory of every way I'd been quietly supporting my family's life while they treated me like a burden. David's house. I owned the mortgage. 3 years ago, when he'd been struggling to qualify for a loan, I'd had one of my companies purchase the note and offer him terms no bank would match: 5% interest on a $400,000 home. His monthly payments were barely covering the interest, and he had no idea that his mother was the one accepting those payments. Esme's car, a BMW X5 that she leased through David's company. What she didn't know was that David's company had a fleet agreement with the dealership, an agreement I'd negotiated and funded through one of my holding companies. Her $300 monthly payment should have been closer to $800. Tommy's private school, $12,000 a year that David thought he was paying through a scholarship program. The scholarship was real, but it was funded entirely by an educational foundation I'd established. Tommy was literally the only recipient. David's office space. He rented a small suite in a downtown professional building for his accounting practice. The building was owned by Whitmore Properties, LLC. His rent was a third of market rate, and he believed he'd negotiated a good deal with the management company. The vacation house they used every summer, a lake cottage that belonged to Esme's friend from college. The friend was real, but she was paid a generous fee by one of my property companies to make the house available to my family every July. David thought they were getting a friendly discount. Every comfort they enjoyed, every financial break they'd received, every time they'd congratulated themselves on finding a good deal or catching a lucky break, it had all been me. 12 years of quietly smoothing their path while enduring their condescension. I saved the document and leaned back in my chair. Tomorrow, all of it would change. I spent the rest of the morning making phone calls. First to my attorney, Marcus Chen, who'd helped me structure my holdings for maximum privacy and tax efficiency. "Mabel," he said warmly when his secretary put me through, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" "I need to make some changes to the family arrangements," I said carefully. "Several properties need to be transitioned to market rates." Marcus had handled my affairs long enough to read between the lines. "I see. Should I prepare termination notices for the various agreements?" "Yes, all of them. I want everything converted to standard commercial terms within 30 days. That's comprehensive. May I ask what prompted this decision?" I thought about Esme's voice calling me a ridiculous old woman, about the laughter that had followed her words, about my son's failure to defend me even once. Let's just say I've gained some clarity about certain relationships. Understood. I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow afternoon. My next call was to Patricia Williams, the director of the educational foundation that funded Tommy's scholarship. "Patricia, I need to discuss the Morrison family scholarship." "Of course. Is there a problem with young Tommy? His teachers say he's doing wonderfully." "Tommy is fine, but I'm restructuring the foundation's priorities. The scholarship will continue, but the funding source needs to be transparent going forward." "I'm not sure I understand." "The family should know exactly who's paying for their child's education. No more anonymous benefactors." There was a pause. "Mabel, that's going to be quite a shock for them." "Yes," I said quietly. "I imagine it will be." My final call was to Helen Rodriguez, who managed my residential properties. Helen, I need you to convert the Morrison property to a standard mortgage immediately. The 5% note? Mabel, if we adjust that to current market rates, their payment is going to more than double. I'm aware of that. Are you sure? This seems sudden. I looked out at the harbor again, watching a small sailboat navigate between larger vessels. The boat looked fragile against the vast water, but it was moving forward under its own power, guided by someone who understood how to work with the wind rather than fighting against it. Sometimes people need to learn to sail without training wheels, I said. By noon, I'd set everything in motion. Within a month, David would discover that his comfortable life had been an illusion. His mortgage payment would jump from $1,800 to $3,800. His office rent would triple. Esme's car lease would adjust to market rates. The lake house would no longer be available for their summer vacations. They would survive. David made good money as an accountant, and Esme could finally put her constant talk about her business acumen to actual use. But they would have to make choices, set priorities, maybe even consider whether a BMW was really necessary when a Toyota would serve the same purpose. Most importantly, they would understand what I'd been protecting them from all these years. The real world, where kindness wasn't guaranteed and family didn't automatically mean financial security. I wasn't doing this out of anger, exactly. Anger was hot and impulsive, and my decisions had been carefully calculated. This was something colder and more permanent. It was the logical consequence of their choices, delivered with the same precision Esme had used to cut me down at that dinner table. As the afternoon sun slanted through the penthouse windows, my phone rang one more time. David again. This time, I answered, "Mom, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day. I've been busy. Look, about last night. Esme feels terrible about what she said. She was just shocked by everything. She wants to apologize." I listened to the sounds of traffic through his phone, imagining him pacing outside his office building, probably sneaking away from work to make this call. Does she, David? Or does she want to discuss how this new information affects her financial prospects? A long pause. That's not. Mom, she's my wife. Whatever issues you two have, we need to work them out. We don't have issues, sweetheart. We have incompatible values. There's a difference. What does that mean? But I closed my eyes, thinking of the little boy who used to crawl into my lap after nightmares, who'd cried when I had to work late shifts, who'd made me Mother's Day cards with his careful 7-year-old handwriting. It means I love you, David. I always have and I always will. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespect, and it doesn't mean funding people who think money matters more than kindness. Are you? Are you cutting us off? I'm giving you the chance to stand on your own. It's what your father would have wanted. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of things unsaid, choices unmade, moments when he could have defended me but didn't. I don't understand, he said finally. You will, I told him gently. Soon enough you will. That evening, I had dinner in the hotel's main restaurant. Not in the private dining room or hidden away where no one could see me, but at a table right in the center of the room. I wore a dress I'd bought that afternoon. Designer, elegant, the kind Esme would have approved of if she'd had any idea how much it cost. The staff treated me with the respectful attention due to the owner, and several other guests nodded politely when they recognized me from previous visits. I was no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be less than I was. For the first time in 12 years, I was exactly who Harold had wanted me to become. A woman who used her resources wisely, who valued character over wealth, but who also refused to let anyone diminish her worth. Tomorrow, my family would begin learning the true cost of their choices. Tonight, I was finally free. 3 weeks later, I was tending to my small herb garden on the penthouse terrace when my phone rang. I'd moved into the hotel permanently, converting one of the smaller suites into a comfortable apartment. After decades of living in cramped spaces to maintain my modest facade, I'd decided to embrace the comfort my success had earned me. The caller ID showed David's number. I let it ring 4 times before answering, giving myself time to prepare for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. Hello, David. Mom. His voice was strained, exhausted. We need to talk. I'm listening. What did you do? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Our mortgage payment. It tripled overnight. The bank says our loan was sold to a new company and the terms have changed. I don't understand how this is legal. I set down my watering can and settled into one of the comfortable deck chairs I'd had installed. The harbor stretched out below me, peaceful and unchanging despite the chaos unfolding in my son's life. "Did you read the paperwork when you signed the original loan?" I asked gently. "Of course I did, but—" "Mom, the payment was $1,800 last month. This month they want $3,800. We can't afford that. Most people can't afford houses they can't actually pay for," I said. "That's why banks typically require 20% down and verify income thoroughly before approving loans." There was a long pause. "You're saying we never qualified for this house?" "I'm saying you qualified for a house, just not that house." I could hear him breathing heavily, probably sitting in his car somewhere, trying to process the implications. "The office rent too," he continued. "They're saying market rate is $3,500 a month instead of $1,200, and Esme's car lease." "Jesus, Mom, they want $800 a month for a car she's been paying $300 for." "That sounds about right for a BMW X5, I said calmly. "Luxury vehicles are expensive to lease." "You did this." It wasn't a question anymore. All of it. "You've been— what? Subsidizing our entire life?" "I've been making it possible for you to live beyond your means without realizing it." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Finally, David spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "Why? Why would you do that to us?" "Because I wanted you to learn to stand on your own. Because handouts don't build character. Because your father taught me that real love sometimes means letting people struggle so they can grow stronger." "That's bullshit and you know it." His voice cracked. "You watched me stress about money for years. You let me worry about the mortgage, about Tommy's school costs, about whether we could afford family vacations. You could have helped, but instead you made everything harder." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his pain. This was the hardest part, knowing that my choices had caused genuine suffering, even if they'd been made with love. "David, in the last 3 years, how many times has Esme made disparaging comments about my financial situation? What does that have to do with anything? How many times has she suggested that I was a burden? That you were supporting your poor mother out of obligation?" Another pause. "Mom, how many family gatherings have I been excluded from because they were too expensive for someone in my situation? How many times has she rolled her eyes when I've tried to contribute to conversations about travel or restaurants or any topic she deemed above my economic station?" "She didn't mean—" "Yes, she did." My voice was firm but not angry. "She absolutely meant every word. And you let her say those things because you believed them too. You both thought you were better than me, more successful, more worthy of respect. The money I was giving you allowed you to feel superior to the woman who was actually funding your lifestyle." I could hear traffic in the background, the sounds of the real world intruding on our conversation. Somewhere nearby, Esme was probably dealing with her own financial revelations. "Where is she now?" I asked. "At home, crying. She's been calling her friends, trying to figure out if there are any legal options to challenge the lease changes or the mortgage transfer." "And what have her friends told her?" "That we signed contracts allowing for these changes, that everything you've done is completely legal." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Mom, we might lose the house." "You might," I agreed. "Or you might make some different choices. Downsize to something more appropriate for your actual income. Trade the BMW for a reliable used car. Send Tommy to public school, which is perfectly adequate education for a bright boy like him." "You want us to give up everything?" "I want you to have what you can actually afford, what you've earned through your own efforts. There's dignity in that, David. Your father and I lived that way for years and we were happy. But you could have afforded more. You were rich the whole time." "Yes, I was. But Harold was never happier than when he was teaching 3rd grade for $35,000 a year. He didn't need expensive things to feel valuable. He found worth in his work, in his family, in simple pleasures that didn't cost anything." I paused, looking out at a sailboat navigating the harbor. "I thought I was raising you to have those same values. I thought if you never knew about the money, you'd learn to find satisfaction in what you could build yourself. Instead, I married someone who only values things she can't afford. The admission hung between us like a bridge. Neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. David, I said carefully, what did Esme say when she found out about the hotel? About my actual financial situation? A long sigh. She was angry at first. Really angry. She kept saying you'd made fools of us, that you'd been laughing at her behind her back. And then she started talking about opportunities, about how this could change everything for our family. She wanted me to call you immediately, to set up a meeting to discuss our new partnership. I felt a familiar ache in my chest. Even now, even after everything, Esme saw dollar signs before relationships. She was angry about being deceived, but only because it meant she'd missed opportunities to benefit from my wealth. She doesn't understand that she burned that bridge 3 weeks ago. Mom, she's my wife, Tommy's mother. Whatever mistakes she's made, she's still family. Being family doesn't excuse cruelty, David. And it doesn't obligate me to fund people who treat me poorly. So what happens now? You just abandon us? The pain in his voice almost broke my resolve. This was my son, the little boy I'd raised alone after Harold died. I'd worked 3 jobs to give him opportunities, had sacrificed everything to ensure his future. The idea of abandoning him was impossible, but there was a difference between abandonment and accountability. I'm not abandoning you, I said gently. I'm giving you the chance to show me who you really are when the money isn't there to complicate things. What does that mean? It means you have choices to make. About your marriage, your priorities, your values. I can't make those choices for you, and I won't use money to influence them anymore. And if we lose everything? Then you'll learn what I learned after your father died, that everything you really need, love, family, self-respect, can't be bought anyway. That evening, I received an unexpected visitor. I was reading in my suite when the front desk called to announce that Tommy was in the lobby with his babysitter, asking to see me. I found my grandson sitting in one of the elegant lobby chairs, his small legs swinging freely as he looked around at the marble columns and crystal chandeliers with wide eyes. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who occasionally watched him, stood nearby looking uncomfortable. Tommy, I said, kneeling down to his level, what are you doing here, sweetheart? Mrs. Patterson drove me, he said seriously. Mom and Dad are fighting a lot, and I wanted to see if you were okay. They said you moved to a hotel, and I thought maybe you were sad. My heart clenched. This innocent child had been worried about me while his parents dealt with their financial crisis. I'm not sad, I assured him, sitting down in the chair next to his. How did you know to find me here? Dad told Mom this was your hotel. I asked Mrs. Patterson if we could visit you. I looked up at the babysitter who shifted nervously. I hope that's all right, Mrs. Whitmore. He was quite insistent, and with all the tension at home. Of course it's all right. I turned back to Tommy. Would you like to see my room? It has a great view of the boats. His face lit up. Really? You live in a hotel now? I do. Come on, I'll show you. As we rode the elevator to the penthouse, Tommy peppered me with questions about living in a hotel, whether I had to make my own bed, if room service brought me breakfast every day. His innocent curiosity was a relief after weeks of dealing with adult complications and motivations. In the suite, he ran immediately to the windows. Wow, Grandma, you can see everything from up here. I can indeed. I joined him at the window. Do you see that blue sailboat? I've been watching it all week. The owner takes it out every evening at sunset. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the boats navigate the harbor. Finally, Tommy looked up at me with serious 7-year-old eyes. Are you mad at Mom and Dad? The question caught me off guard with its directness. Children always saw through to the heart of things. I'm disappointed, I said carefully. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt people they love. Did they hurt you? Yes, they did. But you didn't hurt me, Tommy. You never have. He considered this gravely. Mom says you're really rich now, that you own this whole hotel. I do own this hotel, and several others. Why didn't you tell us before? I sat down on the couch and patted the cushion beside me. Tommy climbed up and curled against my side, the way he used to when he was smaller. Sometimes adults keep secrets because they're trying to protect the people they love, I said. I thought if your parents didn't know about the money, they would love me for who I am instead of what I could give them. That's silly, Tommy said matter-of-factly. I love you because you're my grandma. Money doesn't matter. Out of the mouths of babes. This child understood something his parents had never grasped. You're absolutely right, I said, hugging him closer. Money doesn't matter nearly as much as people think it does. When Mrs. Patterson came to collect Tommy an hour later, I walked them down to the lobby. As I hugged my grandson goodbye, he whispered in my ear, I hope you come home soon, Grandma. The house feels weird without you visiting. I watched them leave, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I might not be visiting that house much longer. Not if David couldn't find a way to make the new mortgage payments. Not if my family continued to prioritize financial comfort over treating each other with basic respect. That night, I made one final phone call. Marcus, it's Mabel. I need to add a provision to my will. Of course. What kind of provision? I looked around the luxurious suite that had become my sanctuary, thinking about Tommy's innocent questions and David's exhausted voice and Esme's calculating response to learning about my wealth. I want to establish a trust for my grandson, something that will pay for his education and provide security, but won't be accessible until he's 30 years old. That's wise. Children from wealthy families often benefit from having some distance between them and large inheritances. And Marcus? I want the trust to include a provision that if his parents attempt to access or borrow against those funds, the money goes to charity instead. There was a pause. That's unusually restrictive. I'm learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect people from their own worst impulses. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my transformation was complete. I was no longer the woman who enabled bad behavior in the name of keeping peace. I was no longer willing to be treated poorly just to maintain relationships. I was exactly who Harold had always believed I could become. Someone who used her resources wisely, loved fiercely, but refused to let anyone take advantage of her generosity. The question now was whether my family could learn to meet me on those terms, or whether they would choose to let their pride and greed cost them everything that actually mattered. 6 months passed before I heard from David again. In that time, I'd settled into a routine that felt more authentic than anything I'd experienced in years. I woke each morning in my penthouse suite, had breakfast on the terrace overlooking the harbor, and spent my days actively managing the business empire I'd built in Harold's memory. For the first time since becoming wealthy, I stopped hiding. I attended board meetings for my various properties, met with architects about renovation projects, and even gave an interview to the business section of the local newspaper about women entrepreneurs over 60. The journalist had been fascinated by my story. A widow who'd parlayed a modest inheritance into a multi-million-dollar hotel chain through careful investment and hard work. Of course, I'd left out certain details, like the fact that my family had been treating me like a charity case while I funded their upper-middle-class lifestyle. I'd also started something new, volunteering at a women's shelter downtown. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I helped serve meals and offered financial planning workshops for women trying to rebuild their lives after leaving abusive situations. It reminded me why Harold had valued work over wealth. There was something deeply satisfying about using my skills to help people who genuinely needed and appreciated the assistance. It was during one of these volunteer sessions that I first heard about David's situation from an unexpected source. Mrs. Whitmore, said Jennifer, one of the shelter's regular clients who was slowly getting back on her feet after leaving her husband. I think I know your son. I looked up from the budget worksheet we'd been reviewing. Oh, David Morrison? He's an accountant? He's been helping me with my taxes for free. He said his mother taught him that successful people have an obligation to help others. My heart clenched. Even in his own financial crisis, David was still giving back. It was exactly the kind of thing Harold would have done. How is he doing? I asked carefully. Jennifer's expression grew concerned. He seemed stressed, really stressed. He mentioned that his family had to move recently, had some financial setbacks. But he still insisted on helping me for free when he found out I couldn't afford professional tax help. That evening, I found myself driving through David's old neighborhood. The house I'd secretly helped him buy stood empty, a for sale sign prominent in the front yard. The BMW was gone from the driveway, replaced by nothing. I drove slowly through the area, remembering the day David had called me excitedly to share the news that his loan had been approved. He'd been so proud, so grateful for what he thought was his own financial success. I'd been proud too, but for different reasons. I'd believed I was giving him the foundation to build a stable life. Instead, I'd built him a house of cards that collapsed the moment I stopped providing the hidden support. My phone rang as I sat parked across from the empty house. David's number. This time, I answered immediately. Mom. His voice was different, older somehow, worn down by months of struggle. Hello, David. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I always pick up when you call, sweetheart. You just haven't called. A long pause. I was angry and ashamed, and I didn't know what to say. And now I understand some things I didn't before. I waited, letting him find his words. We lost the house, he said finally. Last month. We're renting a small apartment across town now. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. Tommy has to share a room with us. My heart ached for my grandson, but I kept my voice neutral. How is Tommy adjusting? Better than Esme and I are, honestly. He thinks it's an adventure, sleeping on an air mattress in our bedroom. He says it's like camping. Despite everything, I smiled. Children were remarkably resilient when the adults in their lives didn't project their own fears onto them. And Esme? Another long pause. Esme? Mom, we're getting divorced. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of that admission. I'd suspected this might happen, but hearing it confirmed still hurt. Not because I was particularly fond of Esme, but because I knew what divorce would mean for David and Tommy. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. Are you? Really? The question was fair. I'd never hidden my feelings about Esme's treatment of me. Yes, I am. I never wanted your marriage to fail, David. I wanted it to improve. It couldn't improve. That's what I finally figured out. His voice grew stronger, more certain. When the money disappeared, when we had to face reality, I saw who she really was. And she saw who I was. What do you mean? She wanted me to fight you. To sue you. To find some way to get back what she thought we were owed. She couldn't understand that you didn't owe us anything. That everything you'd given us had been a gift we never appreciated. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe David had learned something from this painful experience after all. And what did you tell her? I told her that you were right. That we'd been living beyond our means, taking advantage of your generosity while treating you poorly. I told her that if she couldn't see how wrong that was, then we didn't share the same values. How did she respond? She said I was choosing you over her, that I was weak for not fighting for my family's financial security. He let out a bitter laugh. She actually said that our problems were your fault for not being honest about your wealth from the beginning. I shook my head, though he couldn't see it. Even now, Esme couldn't take responsibility for her own choices. Where is she now? She moved back in with her parents. She's telling everyone who'll listen that you're a vindictive old woman who destroyed her marriage out of spite. And what are you telling people? The truth. That I failed to protect my mother from my wife's cruelty, and that you finally protected yourself. The simple honesty of that statement nearly brought me to tears. This was the David I'd raised, the one who could admit mistakes and take responsibility for his choices. David, I said carefully, how are you managing financially? We're making it work. Barely. I had to take on extra clients to cover the rent and expenses. Tommy's in public school now, which is actually fine. His teacher is wonderful, and he's making new friends. I sold Esme's BMW and bought a used Honda. It's not glamorous, but it's reliable, and the payments are manageable. You sound different. I feel different. These past few months have been the hardest of my life, but also the most honest. I know exactly what I can afford now. I know what I've earned through my own work. There's something to be said for that clarity. I thought about Harold, about how he'd insisted on living on his teacher's salary despite having access to millions. David was finally understanding what his father had tried to teach him. "Mom," David continued, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that your answer won't change anything between us. Go ahead. Would you like to see Tommy? I know I don't have the right to ask after everything that's happened, but he misses you. He asks about you constantly." My throat tightened. I'd been hoping for this moment while dreading it at the same time. "I would love to see Tommy, but David, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. I'm not going to hide who I am anymore, and I'm not going to pretend to be less successful than I am just to make other people comfortable. I wouldn't want you to. I'm proud of what you've built, Mom. I should have said that before, but I was too caught up in my own issues to see clearly. And if Tommy asks questions about my lifestyle, about the hotel, about why I live differently than you do, then I'll tell him the truth, that his grandmother is a successful businesswoman who worked hard to build something meaningful. That money doesn't make people better or worse, but how they treat others does." 2 days later, David brought Tommy to the hotel for lunch. I watched from my suite window as they walked through the lobby, Tommy's head swiveling as he took in the elegant surroundings, while David spoke to him quietly, probably preparing him for what he was about to see. When they knocked on my door, Tommy launched himself into my arms before I could even say hello. "Grandma, I missed you so much." I hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair and feeling the solid warmth of his small body against mine. This was what mattered. Not the money, not the property, not even the principle of standing up for myself. This child, this relationship, this love that had nothing to do with financial calculations. "I missed you too, sweetheart. So very much." We had lunch on the terrace, Tommy chattering excitedly about his new school, his new friends, his new neighborhood. He didn't seem traumatized by the change in circumstances. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than he had during those tense family dinners at the old house. "Our apartment is small," he told me matter-of-factly, "but Dad says small spaces are easier to keep clean. And our neighbors are really nice. Mrs. Chen next door taught me how to fold paper cranes." I glanced at David, who was watching his son with a mixture of pride and sadness. The pride was for Tommy's resilience and optimism. The sadness, I suspected, was for all the time they'd wasted living beyond their means instead of appreciating what they actually had. "Tommy," I said carefully, "how do you feel about Mommy and Daddy living in different places now?" His expression grew more serious. "It's sad sometimes, but they don't fight as much now, and Daddy seems happier, even though he works more. Do you understand why they're not living together anymore?" He considered this with the gravity children brought to important questions. "Daddy says sometimes people want different things, and it's better to be honest about that than to pretend everything is okay when it's not." I looked at David with new respect. He was handling this difficult situation with wisdom and age-appropriate honesty. "Grandma," Tommy continued, "Daddy told me you're really good at business, that you own lots of hotels and help people have jobs." "That's right. Are you famous?" I laughed. "Not famous exactly, but I am successful." "Ah, that's cool. Maybe when I grow up I can work at one of your hotels." "If that's what you want to do, and if you work hard in school, maybe you can. Or maybe I'll be a teacher like Grandpa Harold was. Daddy says he was really good at helping kids learn." My heart nearly stopped. David had been talking to Tommy about Harold, keeping his grandfather's memory alive despite never having met him. "Your grandfather would have loved you very much," I said softly. "I know. Daddy shows me pictures sometimes. He says I have Grandpa's eyes." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of simple pleasures. We walked around the hotel grounds, fed ducks at the small pond behind the property, and visited the gift shop where I bought Tommy a small toy sailboat. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just a simple token of our time together. When it was time for them to leave, Tommy hugged me goodbye and whispered, "Will you come visit our apartment sometime? It's not as fancy as this place, but we have good snacks." "I would love to visit your apartment," I told him honestly. As David and I walked toward the elevator, he stopped and turned to me. "Mom, I owe you an apology. Not just for Esme's behavior, but for my own. I let you down in ways I'm still understanding. You were trying to keep your marriage together. I understand that. No, it was more than that. I was embarrassed by your situation, by your modest lifestyle, your small apartment, the way you dressed. I thought Esme's success and sophistication reflected well on me, and I was ashamed that my mother didn't fit into that image. The admission was painful, but necessary. I measured people by the wrong standards, he continued. I valued appearance over character, wealth over kindness, and I taught my son to do the same, at least by example. But you're teaching him differently now. I'm trying to. These past few months have been humbling, but they've also been clarifying. I know who I am now when the props are taken away. I know what actually matters. And what matters? Family. Real family, not the pretense of it. Work that means something. Being able to look at myself in the mirror without shame. Teaching Tommy that how you treat people defines you more than what you own. I reached out and took his hand. Your father would be proud of the man you're becoming. Do you think there's a chance, someday, that we could rebuild our relationship? That you might trust me again? I squeezed his hand gently. David, I never stopped trusting you. I stopped enabling you. There's a difference. And now? Now I think we can build something better than what we had before. Something based on honesty instead of hidden subsidies. Something real. As I watched them drive away in David's modest Honda, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of victory or revenge, but the deeper satisfaction of relationships built on truth rather than obligation. I'd lost a daughter-in-law I'd never really had. I'd caused my son financial hardship that had ultimately forced him to grow as a person. I'd disrupted my grandson's comfortable routine in ways that had actually made him more resilient. The price had been high, but the result was a family that finally knew how to value what truly mattered. For the first time in 12 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. 2 years had passed since that fateful dinner, and I was sitting in my favorite chair on the penthouse terrace, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the harbor. At 71, I'd finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. For most of my adult life, I'd confused the two, allowing people to treat me poorly because I feared solitude more than disrespect. Now, surrounded by the quiet luxury I'd earned but finally felt worthy of enjoying, I understood what Harold had been trying to teach me all those years ago. Wealth wasn't about the things you could buy. It was about the choices you could make. And I'd finally learned to make choices that honored my own worth. My phone buzzed with a text from David. He and Tommy were coming for their weekly Sunday lunch, a tradition we'd established 6 months ago when David had finally saved enough to buy a small house near Tommy's school. It wasn't the grand suburban mansion they'd lost, but it had 3 bedrooms, a small yard where Tommy could play, and most importantly, mortgage payments David could afford on his own income. I'd watched my son transform over these 2 years. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by something that looked like contentment. He worked hard, but within reasonable limits. He drove a car he could afford, took vacations he could pay for, and raised his son with values instead of material aspirations. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago. Esme had remarried quickly, a real estate developer with flashy cars and expensive tastes who appreciated her ambition and shared her priorities. According to David, she seemed happy in her new life, and I was genuinely glad for her. We'd simply been incompatible from the beginning, wanting different things from family relationships. Tommy spent alternate weekends with his mother, returning with stories about fancy restaurants and shopping trips, but he never seemed impressed by the extravagance. If anything, he seemed to prefer the quieter rhythms of life with David, where bedtime stories mattered more than brand names and character counted more than cash. A knock at my door interrupted my morning reflections. When I opened it, I found Tommy holding a carefully wrapped package and wearing the serious expression he got when he had something important to say. "Good morning, Grandma. Happy birthday." My birthday. I'd honestly forgotten. At 71, birthdays felt less like celebrations and more like quiet acknowledgments of time's passage. "Thank you, sweetheart, but my birthday isn't until next month." "I know," he said solemnly, "but Daddy and I decided we wanted to celebrate your real birthday today." I looked past him to David, who was standing in the hallway with his own carefully wrapped gift and the expression that mixed nervousness with determination. "Your real birthday?" I asked. genuinely confused. "The day you decided to be yourself," David said simply. "2 years ago today, you stopped pretending to be someone you weren't. We thought that deserved celebrating." I felt tears prick my eyes as I understood what they were doing. They were marking the anniversary of my transformation, the moment I'd chosen self-respect over family harmony. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Both of you." Tommy immediately ran to the windows to check on his sailboat, a small vessel he'd claimed as his own during our weekly harbor watching sessions. David lingered near the door, still holding his package. "Mom, before we do anything else, I need to say something." I settled into one of the comfortable chairs and gestured for him to sit across from me. "I'm listening. 2 years ago, I thought you were being cruel. I thought you were punishing us for Esme's mistakes, making us suffer because your feelings were hurt. And now? Now I understand that you were being kind in the only way that would actually help us. You forced us to face reality, to grow up, to become the people we should have been all along." He set his gift on the coffee table, but didn't unwrap it yet. "I was angry for months," he continued. "Angry at you for letting us struggle. Angry at myself for not seeing how dependent we'd become. Angry at Esme for caring more about money than family. But mostly, I was angry because I'd failed you as a son. David, no, let me finish. I failed to protect you from my wife's cruelty. I failed to recognize your sacrifices. I failed to appreciate everything you'd done for us while pretending to be struggling yourself. And when you finally stood up for yourself, I was angry at you instead of being proud of you." Tommy looked up from the window. "Daddy, are you gonna cry again?" David laughed, wiping his eyes. "Maybe a little, buddy. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy." "It's okay," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "Grandma cries sometimes too when we talk about Grandpa Harold." I smiled through my own tears. This child had such a gift for reducing complex emotions to simple truths. "Tommy's right," I said. "Sometimes tears are just love that doesn't have anywhere else to go." David reached for his gift, a flat package wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you, but it's also for me, in a way. It's something I should have done a long time ago." I unwrapped it carefully to find a framed photograph. It showed the 3 of us from our lunch 2 weeks ago. Tommy between David and me, all of us laughing at something ridiculous my grandson had said about the ducks in the pond. But it wasn't the image that made me gasp. It was the engraving on the frame. "To Mabel Whitmore, successful businesswoman, loving mother, cherished grandmother. We are proud of everything you've accomplished and grateful for everything you've taught us. Love, David and Tommy." I stared at the words through blurred vision. For so many years, I'd hidden my accomplishments, downplayed my success, pretended to be less than I was to make others comfortable. This simple acknowledgement of my worth felt like a gift beyond price. "Do you like it, Grandma?" Tommy asked, climbing onto the arm of my chair. "I love it," I whispered, pulling him close. "It's perfect." "My turn," Tommy announced, retrieving his own gift. "I made it myself. Well, mostly myself. Mrs. Chen helped a little." His package contained a hand-stitched cloth book, clearly the work of small fingers guided by patient hands. The cover read, "The Story of Grandma Mabel," in careful block letters, decorated with crayon drawings of hotels and sailboats. I opened it to find page after page of Tommy's version of my life story. There were pictures of me as a young mother, working at various jobs to support David. Images of me, building hotels with my smart brain, as the caption read. A drawing of Harold in heaven, smiling down at a woman in a business suit who was clearly meant to be me. But the last page made me cry in earnest. It showed the 3 of us sitting together on my terrace, with a caption that read, "Grandma Mabel learned that being rich means having people who love you just because you're you." "Do you like my book?" Tommy asked anxiously. "It's the most beautiful book anyone has ever given me," I said honestly. "I'm going to treasure it forever, Mrs. Chen says books are the best presents because you can read them over and over and remember the feelings." Mrs. Chen was clearly a wise woman. We spent the afternoon as we always did during their visits. Lunch on the terrace, followed by a walk around the hotel grounds and a trip to feed the ducks. Simple pleasures that cost almost nothing but meant everything. As the sun began to set, painting the harbor in shades of pink and gold, Tommy fell asleep in my lap while David and I talked quietly about his plans to expand his accounting practice and Tommy's progress in school. "Mom," David said eventually, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? The way things happened, I mean. The pain we all went through?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about the lonely months after I'd cut off their financial support, the anguish of watching my family struggle, the fear that I might have damaged our relationships beyond repair. "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to demand better treatment," I said finally. "I regret that I enabled bad behavior for years instead of addressing it directly, but do I regret standing up for myself? Never. Even though it caused us so much hardship? David, look at your son." I gestured to Tommy, sleeping peacefully in my arms. He's happy, secure, loved. He knows his worth isn't tied to what he owns. He values kindness over wealth, character over status. Would he have learned those lessons if we'd continued living the lie? David followed my gaze to his sleeping child. "Probably not. And look at yourself. You're proud of what you've built now because you built it honestly. You know exactly what you can afford and what you've earned. You're teaching Tommy real values instead of empty materialism. Would that have happened if I'd kept subsidizing your lifestyle while accepting disrespect?" "No," he said quietly. "We would have kept taking advantage of your generosity while convincing ourselves we deserved it. The hardship wasn't punishment, sweetheart. It was education. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop protecting people from the consequences of their choices." As twilight settled over the harbor, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been a woman afraid of her own success, hiding her accomplishments to avoid making others uncomfortable. I'd accepted poor treatment because I thought it was the price of maintaining family relationships. Now I was someone who understood that real love didn't require self-diminishment. That respect had to be mutual to be meaningful. That enabling bad behavior wasn't kindness. It was cruelty disguised as love. The money had always been secondary. Harold had known that when he'd written his letter about using wealth as a tool rather than a master. The real inheritance he'd left me wasn't the trust fund. It was the wisdom to know my own worth, and the courage to demand that others recognize it too. "Mom," David said as he prepared to carry sleeping Tommy to the car, "I have something else to tell you." "What's that?" "I've been thinking about what you said about successful people having obligations to help others. I want to start offering free financial planning services to families going through divorce, people who are suddenly facing single-income situations and need help figuring out how to manage." My heart swelled with pride. This was exactly the kind of thing Harold would have done, using his skills to help people who genuinely needed assistance. That's a wonderful idea. I was wondering, would you be willing to help? Not with money, but with advice? You've built something incredible from nothing. You understand financial planning in ways I'm still learning. I would be honored to help. As I watched David carry Tommy to the elevator, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing your values reflected in the next generation. My son had learned to measure success by contribution rather than accumulation. My grandson was growing up understanding that character mattered more than possessions. This was Harold's real legacy. Not the money that had made it all possible, but the principles that had guided how it was used. I walked back to my terrace and poured myself a glass of wine, settling into my favorite chair to watch the last light fade over the harbor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to use my resources wisely, new chances to demonstrate that wealth could be a force for good rather than division. But tonight, I simply sat in the quiet luxury of my own achievement, surrounded by the love of people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. At 71, I had everything I'd ever really wanted: self-respect, authentic relationships, and the knowledge that I'd used my gifts to build something meaningful. I was no longer hiding in the shadows of my own life. I was finally free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.